May 8, 1945. Whitehall. Late afternoon. The crowd fills the street from curb to curb, pressed against the railings, faces lifted toward the balcony. Flags wave. Church bells carry across the city. The war in Europe has ended. On the balcony stands Winston Churchill. He raises his hand. 2 fingers. The V sign. Cameras flash. The image is clean, triumphant, complete. Britain has survived. Germany has fallen. The alliance has held. Inside government offices a short walk away, a different reality is already sealed in ink. Days earlier, in a closed room without press or ceremony, Churchill issued an order to the British chiefs of staff. No speeches, no cabinet debate, no American consultation. The instruction was direct. They were to prepare a plan for war against the Soviet Union. Not a contingency, not an abstract study, an operational plan. The target date was set. July 1st, 1945, less than 8 weeks after victory in Europe. The enemy was specified, the Red Army, the same force still burying its dead from Berlin. The plan carried a name that was not ironic. It was clinical. It was final. Operation Unthinkable. The decision did not originate on a battlefield. It did not follow a provocation. It was made at a desk, under controlled light, with casualty lists from one war still unfinished. Churchill did not ask whether the British public would accept it. He did not ask whether Parliament would authorize it. He asked only whether it could be done. The instruction included a requirement that stunned the planners who received it. If Western manpower proved insufficient, surrendered German formations were to be rearmed and redeployed. Former enemy units were to be issued weapons and placed back into the line, not against their old regime, but against a new one. This was the decision. It was real. It was dated. It was signed. And it was hidden. In early May 1945, the military situation in Europe presented a narrow and brutal reality. The war against Germany was ending, but the balance of power on the continent had already shifted decisively eastward. The Red Army stood where it had stopped. From the Baltic to the Adriatic, Soviet forces occupied the ground that mattered. Their front lines ran through Berlin, Prague, Vienna, and Budapest. They were not advancing by momentum alone. They were entrenched, supplied, and organized after 4 years of continuous large-scale warfare. On paper, the opportunity Churchill believed existed was purely temporal. Western armies were still deployed. American and British formations had not yet been demobilized. Supply lines from Normandy and Antwerp were functioning at full capacity. Air superiority over Western and Central Europe was absolute. The Western Allies controlled the skies, the seas, and the industrial heart of Germany. If a confrontation with the Soviet Union was ever to occur, this was the only conceivable moment. Delay meant American divisions redeploying to the Pacific. Delay meant war fatigue turning into political pressure. Delay meant Soviet forces digging in behind rivers, cities, and rebuilt logistics. Militarily, the theoretical objective was limited and specific. The planners were instructed to consider whether a rapid, concentrated strike could force the Soviet Union to reconsider its position in Eastern Europe, particularly Poland. This was not framed as conquest. It was framed as coercion through force of arms. The logic followed established principles. Surprise would be essential. The opening blow would have to be decisive. Western air power would need to cripple Soviet communications and logistics before massed ground forces could respond. Speed mattered more than territory. The aim was not to defeat the Red Army outright, but to shock it before it could fully reorient. The geography offered both possibility and constraint. Central Europe was open terrain, but it favored the defender once mobilized. Rivers ran east to west. Cities provided natural strongpoints. Any advance would face immediate numerical pressure. The planners understood that Soviet forces were exhausted, but not broken. They had suffered catastrophic losses, yet their replacement system was still functioning. Their command structure had proven resilient under extreme stress. Most importantly, their armies were already in place. They would not need to move to fight. Western forces, by contrast, were dispersed. British units were thinly spread. American formations were preparing for redeployment or occupation duties. The logistical system was designed for stabilization, not renewed high-intensity offensive warfare. Even under the most optimistic assumptions, success depended on factors outside military control. American participation was essential. Without U.S. manpower and industrial backing, any operation collapsed immediately. Yet no political commitment from Washington existed. No authorization had been sought. The opportunity, such as it was, existed only on maps and calendars. It depended on acting before demobilization, before public opinion shifted, before alliances hardened into post-war realities. It was a fleeting window. The planners were asked to determine whether it was real or merely apparent. Churchill's assessment did not emerge from emotion or impulse. It was the product of long familiarity with the Soviet system and an institutional memory sharpened by previous failures of appeasement. He did not view the Red Army as a temporary wartime partner. He viewed it as a permanent instrument of state power, directed by a leadership that treated agreements as tools, not constraints. In his private communications, he returned repeatedly to one conclusion: Soviet behavior would be determined by opportunity, not promises. By the spring of 1945, the indicators were already visible. Soviet forces were not withdrawing from territories they had liberated. They were consolidating. Political officers moved alongside military commanders. Local governments were being reshaped before peace treaties existed. This was not post-war confusion. It was deliberate preparation. Churchill understood that military momentum created political facts. He had watched this principle operate in reverse in 1940, when Britain's lack of strength invited pressure rather than restraint. He believed the same logic now applied to Eastern Europe. Once Soviet control was normalized, it would be irreversible without force. His preparation took a specific form. He did not rally public opinion. He did not issue speeches. He did not attempt to build a coalition. He went directly to planners. This was not because he expected immediate execution, but because he wanted an answer to a single question: was there any credible military leverage left? He framed the problem narrowly. The objective was not the destruction of Soviet power. It was the restoration of balance. He wanted to know whether a limited but violent demonstration of force could compel negotiation from a position of strength rather than concession. This framing was deliberate. He understood the limits of British power. He understood the exhaustion of the country. He also understood that American commitment was uncertain and conditional. His warning was implicit in the order itself. If a plan could not be made now, it never would be. Churchill's credibility with his military advisors rested on precedent. He had been early in identifying German rearmament. He had been isolated, then vindicated. His warnings about Hitler in the 1930s had been dismissed as alarmism until they became undeniable fact. That history mattered in the room, even when his conclusions were unwelcome. He did not instruct planners to assume Soviet weakness. He instructed them to assume Soviet strength. He asked for worst-case assessments. He asked how long Western forces could sustain operations. He asked what happened if the first blow failed. The inclusion of German manpower was not ideological. It was logistical. He understood that experienced formations already existed, that they knew the terrain and the opponent, and that they could be controlled under Allied command. This was not rehabilitation. It was expediency. His warning extended beyond the battlefield. He believed that once American forces disengaged, Britain would stand alone in a Europe dominated by a hostile power. He believed that waiting for consensus would produce paralysis. He believed that delay itself was a decision. Churchill did not claim certainty. He claimed urgency. He did not promise success. He demanded analysis. His preparation was not a call to war, but an insistence that the cost of inaction be measured with the same rigor as the cost of action. The planners were not asked to justify his fears. They were asked to test them against reality. That was the warning embedded in the order. If the answer came back negative, it would close the question permanently. If it came back even marginally positive, it would redefine the post-war world. He had seen windows close before. He did not intend to let this one close without knowing what lay on the other side. The response from the military system was not emotional. It was procedural, and it was shaped by forces Churchill could not command. The British chiefs of staff did not challenge the order directly. They translated it into staff language and began the process of analysis. In doing so, they exposed the first constraint. Britain could not act alone. Any offensive against the Soviet Union required overwhelming American participation. Without it, the plan failed before it began. That participation did not exist. The United States had not been consulted. The new president had not been briefed. The American public had not been prepared. Senior American commanders were already focused elsewhere. The Pacific remained unfinished. Japan still stood. American divisions were earmarked for redeployment, not retention in Europe. This was not a military oversight. It was political reality. At the institutional level, alliance management overrode operational logic. The Anglo-American coalition had survived 6 years of war by suppressing strategic disagreement in public and resolving it privately. Operation Unthinkable inverted that formula. It assumed American commitment without American consent. Within the British system itself, resistance took subtler forms. Civil servants understood the electoral calendar. Britain was weeks away from a general election. The population was exhausted. Rationing continued. Demobilization was promised. A new war, especially one fought alongside recently surrendered German soldiers, would be indefensible in Parliament. The rearmament proposal triggered alarm not because it was immoral, but because it was uncontrollable. German units could be armed, but not politically laundered. The symbolism alone risked shattering domestic legitimacy. The British Army would not merely be fighting the Soviet Union. It would be explaining itself to its own population every day of the war. The chiefs of staff also recognized another constraint. Intelligence parity no longer existed. During the war, Allied insight into German intentions had been deep and continuous. Against the Soviet Union, it would be shallow and uncertain. Soviet operational secrecy, internal security, and political control limited reliable assessment. Planning assumptions rested on incomplete data. This uncertainty magnified risk. Any initial advantage depended on surprise. But surprise against a force already mobilized, already suspicious, and already occupying defensive terrain was fragile. If the first blow failed, escalation would be automatic and catastrophic. Institutional caution hardened into resistance when worst-case scenarios were modeled. Planners did not imagine stalemate. They imagined collapse. Soviet counteroffensives would not stop at Berlin. They would move west until opposed by water or exhaustion. Britain itself would become a frontline state. At this point, the process itself began to constrain the decision. Once the analysis was formalized, it entered the record. It could be shared, reviewed, and referenced. Churchill could not erase its conclusions without exposing the mechanism he had activated. The military language was restrained, but decisive. The operation was described as hazardous. This was not rhetorical. In staff terms, it signified a plan with a high probability of failure and unacceptable strategic consequences. Political realities reinforced the conclusion. A change of government was imminent. Even if Churchill retained office, his mandate would be weakened. If he lost, the plan would die instantly. There was no institutional continuity capable of carrying it forward against opposition. The system did not accuse Churchill of recklessness. It neutralized him through procedure. The plan was answered, not executed. The chiefs of staff did not refuse. They complied fully, and in doing so, closed the path forward. Churchill responded not with argument, but with adjustment. He requested a revised study. The objective shifted. Instead of offensive action, planners were asked to examine defensive preparations against a potential Soviet advance. This reframing acknowledged the verdict without admitting defeat. The original plan was not destroyed. It was classified. Its conclusions were sealed. The system absorbed the shock and restored equilibrium. In this process, no individual acted as an antagonist. The constraint emerged from intersecting pressures: electoral politics, alliance dependency, institutional risk aversion, strategic exhaustion. Each factor alone was manageable. Together, they made the decision unexecutable. The overruling did not take the form of a vote or a confrontation. It occurred through analysis, delay, and the quiet authority of procedure. By the time the final assessment was delivered, the moment had passed. The decision had been made. The system had answered it. And the answer was final. What followed was not a battle, but a forecast of one, and the forecast was worse than Churchill had anticipated. Once the planners moved beyond theoretical assumptions and into consequences, the operation collapsed under its own weight. The initial assault was no longer the central problem. What mattered was what happened next. If the first blow failed to dislodge Soviet forces or fracture their command structure, the Red Army would not pause. It would respond with scale. Soviet doctrine favored counteroffensive saturation, not containment. Western planners calculated that within weeks, Soviet formations could concentrate overwhelming force against any exposed Allied salient. The geography turned hostile immediately. Any Western advance would create a narrow front pushing east into territory already stripped of infrastructure. Supply lines would lengthen while Soviet lines shortened. Rail networks ran east-west under Soviet control. The deeper Allied forces pushed, the more dependent they became on vulnerable logistics. The numbers were unforgiving. Even after years of war, Soviet manpower reserves remained deeper than those of Britain and its allies. Losses that would cripple Western armies could be absorbed by Soviet replacement systems. Attrition favored the defender, and the defender was already in position. The rearmed German units did not solve this. They added manpower, but not legitimacy. Their presence would inflame Soviet propaganda, harden resistance, and remove any possibility of negotiated restraint. What was intended as a force multiplier became a political accelerant. Planners also identified a failure state with no recovery. If Allied forces were checked and forced onto the defensive, there was no secure fallback line on the continent. The Rhine was not a barrier to a determined Soviet advance. Once crossed, Western Europe offered no natural stopping point short of the Channel coast. In that scenario, France would fall not by defeat, but by momentum. The Low Countries would be overrun as transit space, not objectives. The ports that sustained Allied logistics would be captured or neutralized. Britain would face the prospect it had avoided since 1940, direct exposure to continental dominance by a hostile power. The naval advantage did not offset this. Control of the sea mattered only if the land front held. Air superiority mattered only if airfields remained available. In the projected counteroffensive, both were at risk within weeks. The planners were explicit. This was not a limited war that could be paused or negotiated away. Once initiated, escalation was irreversible. No mechanism existed to prevent expansion beyond Europe. The conflict would become total by default. The most severe consequence was temporal. The war the British public believed was over would resume immediately, with higher stakes and fewer allies. American commitment could not be assumed after failure. If Washington disengaged, Britain would be isolated against the largest land army in the world. The chiefs of staff did not soften the conclusion. They did not recommend revision. They did not propose mitigation. They stated that the plan's failure mode led directly to strategic catastrophe. This was the moment the decision reached its end state. The original order had asked whether the unthinkable could succeed. The answer was not ambiguous. It could not. And if attempted, it would not merely fail. It would reverse the outcome of the war just concluded. The consequence of the decision was therefore negative action. Nothing moved. No orders followed. No units were prepared. The battlefield consequences existed only on paper, but they were decisive enough to halt everything else. The war did not resume because the forecast showed that losing the peace would be easier than losing the next war. In the years immediately after 1945, Operation Unthinkable ceased to exist in any usable sense. It was not debated, revised, or quietly maintained. It was sealed. Churchill's request for a defensive variant allowed the original plan to be reclassified without confrontation. Both documents were placed under the highest level of secrecy. Their existence was denied. No reference appeared in memoirs, parliamentary records, or official histories. The silence was deliberate. When Churchill lost the general election in July 1945, the plan lost its only sponsor. The incoming government under Clement Attlee inherited the files without the impulse behind them. Attlee's priorities were domestic reconstruction, demobilization, and alliance stability. A confrontation with the Soviet Union was not considered policy. It was considered liability. Within the military establishment, the conclusions of the planning staff hardened into institutional memory. The assessment was never formally repudiated because it did not need to be. It had answered its own question. There was nothing to revive. As the Cold War developed, Britain aligned itself firmly with American strategy. Containment replaced confrontation. NATO replaced unilateral calculation. The prospect of independent British action against the Soviet Union disappeared entirely. The conditions that had made Operation Unthinkable conceivable no longer existed. For decades, the episode remained buried. Historians suspected fragments. Journalists pursued rumors. The British government maintained denial. The files were neither leaked nor selectively released. They were simply left untouched. When declassification finally occurred in 1998, the reaction was muted. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union no longer existed. What had once seemed incendiary now appeared historical. The documents revealed no secret cabal and no imminent execution order. They revealed process. A prime minister had asked a question. His system had answered it. The answer had been preserved exactly as written. Post-war memoirs from British military leaders indirectly corroborated the tone of the assessments. There was no bitterness in their language, only relief that the plan had remained theoretical. American records showed no awareness of any British intention to act independently. This was never a near miss. It was a closed internal inquiry. In hindsight, Operation Unthinkable became less a plan than a diagnostic test. It measured the distance between political fear and military reality. That distance proved insurmountable. Churchill's later speeches about the Iron Curtain were delivered without reference to the plan. He warned of Soviet domination, but within the framework of alliance and deterrence. The instrument he had briefly considered was gone. The post-war record does not portray a suppressed opportunity. It documents a boundary. Once crossed, Britain would have faced consequences it could not manage. The planners understood this. Their conclusion shaped policy more than any speech. By the time the files were opened, the verdict had already been enforced for half a century. No action had followed. No revision had been attempted. The plan had done its work by existing and by being rejected. Operation Unthinkable did not fail in execution. It ended in assessment. That outcome defined Britain's post-war trajectory as clearly as any victory or defeat. The record is complete. Operation Unthinkable was not the product of madness or fantasy. It was the outcome of a deliberate calculation made at a moment when power, fear, and timing briefly overlapped. Churchill saw the post-war order forming before treaties were signed. He understood that armies, not promises, would decide Europe's future. His decision was not validated by execution. It was validated by refusal. The military system did not reject his premise. It rejected his margin. The balance of force was already lost. Any attempt to recover it through violence would not have restored equilibrium. It would have destroyed it. Britain would have exchanged a victorious peace for an unwinnable war. Churchill was correct about Soviet intentions. Eastern Europe did not regain its independence through diplomacy. The division of the continent followed the lines the Red Army had drawn. On that point, his foresight was exact. He was incorrect about leverage. By 1945, Britain no longer possessed the capacity to impose outcomes alone. Power had shifted irreversibly to larger systems. The age of unilateral decisions had ended, even for victors. Operation Unthinkable exposed that transition with unusual clarity. A prime minister could still issue the order. He could not command the result. The system absorbed the decision, tested it, and quietly neutralized it. No catastrophe followed because the plan was never attempted. No heroism was required because restraint prevailed. The outcome was decided in planning rooms, not on beaches or bridges. The case is closed. The files are open. The judgment is settled. This was not the war that almost happened. It was the moment Britain learned that some wars could no longer be chosen. If you want more investigations like this, examine the record, not the myth. Subscribe. Leave a comment. The archives are not finished speaking.